Hi, and welcome back. I talked about mix knobs last week, but I didn't mention one potential difference between parallel processing on a send and parallel processing within a plugin. If the plugin introduces phase shift that could cause problems in parallel, a built-in mix knob can potentially sidestep those problems. This is the most extreme example I've found so far. Shaperbox can do multi-band processing using minimum phase filters for low latency. That means phase shift at the crossover frequency when using 12 dB slopes or higher. So if I use Reaper's mix knob to set a 50% wet mix, the result is a notch at the crossover frequency. And the same thing would happen if I ran this as a send effect. Notice, however, that if I use the plugin's own master dry-wet control, no such cancellation occurs. What sorcery is this? Well, I haven't seen the code, and I doubt I would understand it if I did, but I can guess what's going on under the hood. Rather than use the raw input as the dry signal, the plugin instead uses the summed outputs of the crossover filters to get a dry signal with identical phase shift to the wet signal. That way they mix together with no unexpected side effects. This is a potential advantage that only built-in mix knobs have. If the plugin introduces any phase shift, from oversampling filters, for example, the plugin's own mix knob can circumvent any resulting issues by blending an oversampled wet signal with a dry signal that's been oversampled in exactly the same way. That brings us to the Softube compressors that I featured in that earlier video. These don't provide any oversampling options, not even in the settings. But that doesn't mean they don't use oversampling. Here's a frequency analysis in Plugin Doctor showing the telltale steep anti-aliasing filter right up at the top. If I increase the sample rate to 96K, we still see that filter. But it goes away at 192K. So my guess is the plugin does 4 times oversampling at 44.1 or 48, 2 times at 88.2 or 96, and disables the oversampling for anything higher. But if the oversampling is non-negotiable, that means you're always stuck with the negative effects. Latency for linear phase, or phase shift for minimum phase. So, which is it? The reported latency is only 4 samples. Not quite nothing, but nowhere near as much as any linear phase oversampling plugins I've ever tested. If I run an impulse through it, the impulse response is nowhere near symmetrical. So I'm going to conclude that these are minimum phase oversampling filters, and that usually means phase shift in the high frequencies. Here's a graph comparing the phase shift from a couple of different plugins that offer minimum phase oversampling options. The orange plot is FabFilter Saturn, green shows Cytomic the Glue, and Softube VCA is pinky purple. At first glance, the VCA compressor appears to have the most phase shift, but it's important to realise that gentle deviations from zero don't really matter and won't cause any problems even in parallel. We need 180 degrees of phase shift to cause a notch filter when mixed with the dry signal, so we're really only concerned with those vertical lines where the phase hits 180 degrees, disappears off the bottom of the graph and reappears at the top again. Let's zoom into just that top octave. The FabFilter plugin hits 180 degrees a little above 15K. The Glue is up at nearly 17K, but the VCA compressor gets right up to 18 kHz before the first potential full cancellation occurs. Also important to note, both the other plugins we're comparing here actually have higher latency than the VCA compressor. Saturn is still pretty insignificant at only 8 samples, but that's still twice as much. And the Glue needs 14 samples to give us that green plot. To be totally clear, the phase shift from both the FabFilter and Cytomic plugins is likely to be totally inaudible in any scenario that doesn't involve blending with the dry signal, and in that scenario you have the option to use linear phase oversampling, or no oversampling, instead. But the Softube minimum phase oversampling manages to push most of the potentially harmful phase shift up higher than the other 2 plugins, while also keeping the latency lower at the same time. However, it's not negotiable. You can't turn it off or switch to linear phase instead. Assuming that running your project at a higher sample rate isn't an option, you're stuck with this phase shift whatever. And if you run it in parallel, you're going to get a dip, and potentially a notch depending on the gain settings, at about 18 kHz. Someone commented about this under that last parallel compression video. Once again, I can't find the comment now. I'm going to have to start screenshotting interesting comments as soon as I see them, or else they get buried. But it linked to a Gearspace thread that's easy to find, full of people complaining about this apparent flaw and hoping for a fix. I don't consider it a flaw, however. I think this was a deliberate design choice and should be considered a feature. There are two main reasons why I'm not concerned about that 18K notch. First of all, I'm in my 5th decade, and I spent 2 of those decades working as a live engineer. Expecting to be able to hear a very narrow notch way up there seems optimistic. Even if you can still hear those frequencies clearly, they're a lot less important than you might think in most cases. One of the Gearspace commenters mentioned drum overheads as a possibly problematic signal, but more often than not, I low-pass my drum overheads at around 10K, so I'm not convinced. Most of the sizzle and brightness in cymbals is around the 8 to 10K range, and if there's significant content higher than that, it sounds wrong to me, kind of plasticky and artificial. And my reason number 2 is, I usually work at a 48 kHz sample rate when mixing, not 44.1 as this phase plot represents. If I switch to 48K instead, that first 180-degree reversal is now up at 20K. So the notch in parallel will also be at 20K, and I definitely can't hear that. This is, I think, the most compelling reason I've yet found to mix at 48 instead of 44.1. Anyway, here's what I think the Softube design brief was. Make it as analog as possible, including not having to worry about whether you need oversampling or if the latency will cause any problems. It should, as far as possible, be just like using an analog compressor. And the approach they've taken gets remarkably close. There will never be significant aliasing, just like an analog compressor. There will never be significant latency. 4 samples means I can play a guitar through it without feeling any additional delay. I don't have to put up with lower quality processing while tracking, or have to remember to switch on the oversampling for the mix. I only have to worry about dialing in compression settings. The special minimum phase oversampling that Softube have come up with gives us a best of all worlds solution. Low latency and low aliasing at the same time, with the only downside being that potential 18K notch in the specific situation that you have a parallel send in a 44.1K project. So let's consider that worst case scenario. Your project is at 44.1, the parallel compression is non-negotiable, and it has to be on a send. There's no way for you to reroute such that you can use the built-in mix knob instead. And you're lucky or young enough to have ears that are truly bothered by that 18K dip. There is still a fairly easy solution, and it's basically the same one that the built-in mix knob uses. Set up your routing such that the dry signal also passes through an instance of the same compressor. You'll probably need to create another bus to make sure the dry and wet paths both pass through just one compressor instance. Then set the one for the dry path fully dry with the gain at unity. This compressor is now doing nothing at all except shifting the phase to match the wet signal path, and the combined signal will now be free of any notches. As a Reaper user, however, I also have another option available. I can use Reaper's built-in oversampling instead. If I upsample the plugin to 192 kHz, it now thinks it's running in a 192K project, so it will disable its own internal oversampling. And if I make sure Reaper is set to use the rate brain interpolation in the project settings, we're now using linear phase oversampling instead. There are a couple of reasons this might not be better, however. The latency is now quite significant. 3,584 samples means approximately 70 milliseconds of latency, which means I won't be tracking guitar through this setup. It's strictly for mixdown when the latency can be compensated. And I'm also seeing slightly higher CPU use reported by Reaper. I have previously stated that I consider linear phase oversampling to be superior to minimum phase, but the Softube compressors don't use normal minimum phase filters, and I might consider this an exception. I have also previously stated that in a well-designed plugin, it's probably better to use the built-in oversampling rather than brute forcing it from the outside. Note that this video isn't sponsored by Softube at all. That's probably less obvious than when I was criticising their mix knobs. They did give me licenses for these plugins, but I didn't promise anything in return, and I'm making this video just because I felt like talking about the subject. But after my parallel compressors video, I got an email introduction to a Softube developer who was able to confirm my conclusions about the oversampling filters.
We often use a type of elliptical filter with a fairly flat phase response up until the cutoff frequency. The textbook version of such filter is minimum phase, but we have tweaked it to have a bit of latency to make it easier to compensate for. The reason for using that filter is mainly latency, but it's also that once, a long time ago, when I could hear such high frequencies, I preferred the sound of that filter as opposed to similar linear phase filters. But I doubt I could tell the difference today.
And he offers some further insights as well.
We often employ several different types of oversampling and filters in a single product, depending on the needs of the algorithm. For example, the feedback loop of a compressor typically has its own oversampling, which isn't easily seen from the outside, but has a big effect on the sound.
So the oversampling inside this plugin is rather more sophisticated than the brute force oversampling that Reaper can deploy. When we test in Plugin Doctor, all we see is the oversampling used for the main audio path and the variable gain stage. It doesn't tell us anything about the sidechain and what's going on inside that. When the developers know what they're doing, and the plugin includes its own oversampling, I think it's usually preferable to go with that rather than Reaper's version. And of course, if you're not a Reaper user, the same will apply to wrappers like Meta plugin, which can do the same kind of brute force oversampling in any DAW. That kind of wraps it up then. Don't fear the phase shift is the message once again. And if you're a Softube user and you're fond of using their compressors on sends, maybe consider switching to 48K tracking and mixing instead of 44.1. That's all. Thanks for watching.